Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Langlands. I'm a visual effects supervisor at Weta Digital, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our work on War for Planet of the Apes. War is the third film in the modern day franchise telling the story of Caesar and his evolution from a cute little chimpanzee baby into the leader of his people. It's also the third time around for Weta under overall VFX soup Dan Lemon. Over the years we've refined our tools and techniques, but the basic workflow is still pretty much the same, and we refer to that as performance capture. And that's formed of two complementary components. The body capture part you're probably already familiar with. That's all the actors running around in tight grey unitards with little white dots all over them. While the facial performance aspect is much more involved, and that's not something we've talked about in great detail before. So first of all, the body capture component. When you think of motion capture, you tend to think of something like this. That's the actors dressed up in grey suits on a nice, warm, dry capture stage. Unfortunately, what it's like more often than not on an Apes movie is this: outside on a freezing Canadian night in the pouring rain, or in a blizzard. Over the years, we've gotten pretty good at protecting our motion capture cameras from the elements, but the humans are often left to fend for themselves. Each of those performers is wearing an active suit. So all of those little dots you see are a silicone housing over an infrared LED. And the LEDs are controlled by the backpack that each actor is wearing. And that provides power, and it syncs the LEDs to the shutter open on the motion capture cameras. And that's because we want the LEDs to flash extremely bright for as short a time as possible in order that the camera sees just a little white dot and not a motion blurred streak. And this is what one camera sees. And here's all of them together. And so by triangulating from these views, the software can work out where each of those dots is in 3D space and give us a moving cloud of 3D points like this. And then we can take that and fit a skeleton with the actor's known proportions to the point cloud to reconstruct the motion. Finally, that's retargeted from the actor's proportions to the ape skeleton. We then need to go in and hand animate the feet and the hands, particularly the fingers, because they're not well captured by the bodysuits, of course. And because the ape's proportions are somewhat different than the humans, there's a certain amount of cleanup involved to avoid self-intersections and penetration with the ground. And here's the final motion version. We've also got facial animation in there, which we'll talk about a little bit later. For the motion to look real, though, we also need dynamics. Muscles contract and jiggle, and skin and fat slide around over the bone. And we simulate all these things from the inside out. So we're lucky enough to have a very good relationship with Wellington Zoo, where they keep chimpanzees. And they've shared their MRI scan data with us. And we can use this to build a 3D model of the inside of a chimpanzee. And this tells us all about the muscle size and density and position, how they all attach to the bones with the ligaments and everything. And this helps us figure out how everything articulates and joins together. And we can then reproduce this in our muscle and skin dynamic system we call tissue. So we start with the ape skeleton, and this is just taken directly from the motion pass here. And then we attach muscles onto that, and we simulate all the collisions, jiggle, and tension. The muscles themselves are flexed based on velocity or rotation of the joints, which they control. But the creature TDs can, of course, choose to flex on a particular frame if they want to get a specific effect. Then the fascia layer goes over the top of that. This is a membrane that surrounds all the muscles. It's essentially a tight bag that holds everything together, and it can slide in some areas while being pinned in others. Next, the sliding skin layer goes over the top of everything else, and here we simulate the wrinkling of the skin as it bunches up, for instance, in the armpits and the elbows. And finally, we simulate the fur dynamics on top of everything. And here's how it looked in the final shots. You'll note here that we've also created a CG water puddle for the apes to roll around in, as well as simulating the raindrops hitting the fur. And this, of course, is very important for integrating with the plate where all that stuff's going on. So, before looking at the facial performance, I'd like to talk a little bit about the character build process. And in order to do that, I'd like to introduce you to Bad Ape. He's a new character to the series and is essential both to the story, but also to provide a bit of levity and humor in what would otherwise be a pretty dark film. So let's take a look at him in action.
34, 35, 36, 37, 30, 37. I do. What now? What? Oh no! Oh no! No, 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 no. Okay.
So when we're beginning a new ape, we normally like to cast them by finding reference of an existing ape in a zoo somewhere. For instance, for Red, who's another new character to the series, and he's one of my favorites, we cast a gorilla called Winston, who lives at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park. There's a photo of Winston. And here's our final build for him. I love this guy, he just looks so mean. For Bad Ape, we were working from a single photo. Matt wanted him to be old, a little wise and world-weary, but at the same time with a naive, innocent quality to him as well. So this is the chimp that he chose for Bad Ape. And we start by fitting a basic chimpanzee model to the picture and then start sculpting to match all the details in there. We like to put as much detail into this stage as possible, all the wrinkles in the brow there, the cheeks and the muzzle. The chimp's got a heavily wrinkled face, so that gives him that wizened, sort of wise, world-weary look we're after. And those big, beautiful eyes are super expressive and speak to that childlike, curious quality for the character. And we want all of that high-res detail in the base sculpt so that when we animate him, we can make sure that the animators can see all the stuff moving correctly, that all those wrinkles collide and fold and have the right feeling of mass and volume. So here's his final sculpt. For shading him, here we have Bad Ape with the base color map painted in Mari. And most of the shading work is just adding successive layers of detail onto him. So we'll start working in finer and finer wrinkles, all the way down to the skin microgeometry level. This layer just works in a little bit of balancing for the subsurface scattering in different areas of the face to speak to different levels of depth in the skin. And this one, it's kind of hard to see if I flick back and forward. It's just a little bit of wetness around his eyes and his nose. And if you're thinking these are really small changes we're making here, that's because they are. The level of fine detail we need for working making a character that's believable like this is quite intense. This layer's the corneum stratum. That's just the top layer of skin that's slightly forward scattering. And here's the finishing touch. This is just a scattering of dried skin over the face to make him look like he's been out in the wilderness for a while and hasn't just stepped straight out of a spa. With the base shading down, we also need to track how those looks change over the course of the movie. For instance, with Caesar, he goes through quite a lot in this film, so we need to reflect that in his look. And the way that we track these changes is much the same way that you track continuity for hair and makeup on a film set. So what we do is we just start building these look sheets. Here's Caesar's from the start of the movie. You can see he's looking pretty reasonably healthy here. And he's got lots of little water droplets in his fur because it's quite wet in the forests where the apes live, and also because he lives behind a huge waterfall. A little bit further on, there's a scene which is quite emotional and where Caesar's struggling against another ape. So we've added a little bit of flushing to the cheeks here and a little bit of redness to the eyes to speak to the emotion of the scene. A little bit later on again, he gets knocked out by the butt of another character's rifle. So here we've painted in the wound above his left eye and added a little bit of bruising around his eye bags. And then things get really bad for him and he's strung up on a cross in the freezing cold. So here we've given him a deathly grey pallor to his skin to make him feel really unhealthy and like he might be on the verge of death. He's still got some even more pronounced bruising around the eyes, but the wound from earlier is kind of healed over now, so now that's just some dried blood. So we build these continuity sheets and present them to Matt Reeves, the director, to make sure that he's happy with the different looks that Caesar's going to have before we roll them into the film. All our apes obviously need a fur pass as well, and Weta's grooming tool, Wig, gives our artists an amazing level of control over the fur. Instead of working with a complex graph of deformers and maps, our grooming artists simply sculpt the hair, as you can see here. There's no interpolation at render time. Every one of those curves is a hair that will appear in the final render. And they can control the density and the length. They can comb the hair. They can trim it like you would at a barber shop. And they can even get right in and move individual CVs and curves around. And we find that this level of control is essential for getting the characters exactly as we want them. Now, you might be thinking that micro-adjusting every single curve on the character is going to be a bit laborious for doing an entire groom, and you'd be right. So we give our artists a set of tools for working on the macro level as well. Here's one of the coolest ones. This is the clone stamp tool. And as the name suggests, it allows the artist simply to copy and paste patches of the groom over the character to fill them out. And then those copy-pasted areas are just blended seamlessly back into the rest of the groom. We also upgraded our first shading model for this film. Our previous model works great for human hair, but animal hairs have a core called the medulla running through the middle, and this turns out to be incredibly important for the scattering from the hair fiber. Using the human model on the apes on the previous movies gave us some problems, particularly at grazing angles when the light was behind them. And here the hair would blow out and go flat. And we'd have to make per-shot adjustments in every shot almost to get the lighting to look right as we wanted it. With the new model, we found the effects of the light on the fur to be completely consistent across all the different lighting environments. And this was especially important because as the apes go on a huge journey over the course of the movie, they go through all different kinds of environments, from snowbound mountains, as you see here, from sun-drenched beaches, and the forest where they start out. So this was a huge time saver for us. We also have a couple of different costumes in the movie. So something as seemingly simple as a jacket and hat can be almost as complex as the character themselves. For Bad Ape's beanie, we modeled the knit pattern explicitly with polygons, and then covered it with a layer of hair to get that fuzzy knitted feeling. The jacket also has a knitted panel, so that gets the same treatment. And then there's almost as many hairs on the hat and jacket as there are on Bad Ape himself. And there's even more on this natty parka that he wears when we first meet him in the film. And that jacket's fully lined with fur as well. So since our apes are traveling through all different kinds of environments, we need to be able to reflect that with little bits and pieces that they pick up in their fur as they go, particularly snow. So Wig allows the artist just to paint predefined geometry pieces into the fur exactly where they want to. Here's our lead grooming artist, Nick Wilson, just painting in some pre-generated snowflakes. And then once they've painted them in and adjusted the size and the density how they want, Wig will just carry those pieces with the groom as they go. So for several shots, we just generated 3 different looks representing light, medium, and heavy snowfall on the fur. And this covered us for a large number of shots where the apes weren't directly interacting with the fur, and we could just drop these in as required for the context. Of course, our apes did interact with the snow directly in a bunch of shots, so we needed to handle snow getting stuck into the fur as well. And the way we do that is we convert the ground to a signed distance field, and then we can track where each hair intersects with the ground and accumulate a snow onto the hair where that occurs. So we just back project onto the groom more snowflakes where they're touching the ground and accumulate frame by frame as we go. Just adding more snow onto the groom doesn't really give the right look, though. For instance, here on the left, Caesar's looking a little bit sugar dusted, and if you increase the density even more, then you get that unfortunate abominable snowman look on the right there. So what we do is we run a bunch of processing on the snowflakes in order to pull them together into chunks. And then we just discard the ones that are too far outside of those chunks or outside the hair or even too far deep inside the groom, because what we want is the snow accumulation on the outside of the fur where it's touched the ground. And when you do that, you get something like this, which looks much better. And here's how it appeared in the movie.
I don't see riders.
So we've seen earlier how we capture the actor's body performance with standard motion capture techniques. But as I mentioned, the facial performance part is much more involved. So we do capture the actors' performances with the head-mounted cameras that they all wear. And we can solve and retarget this in much the same way that we do for the bodies. And that's what we often do for more human-like characters. But we find for the apes, because the anatomy is very different, and because we're so focused on getting an exact match to the performances, the results that we get from the capture and retarget process aren't really what we need for creating that lifelike, believable performance that we're after, that you can emotionally invest in. So nearly all the ape faces in the movie are keyframe animated by hand. Now, it's important to note at this stage that we're not creating or changing the performance, we're translating it from what the actor did. The performance the actor gave on the day is the one that they worked out with the director, Matt. And everything that we do, be it through motion capture techniques or keyframe animation, is in the pursuit of getting that performance to come across through the actor's simian alter egos. As you can see here with Karen Conoval playing Maurice, we're translating her performance as closely as possible because she is that orangutan. And a great example to show how important Karen's performance is to the character is this test that we did. So we knew on this movie that Maurice was going to be required to give more dialogue than he did in the last one. So we did this quick test matching this footage of Karen giving an interview about her experience on the last movie, just to check that Maurice actually had the range and the right shapes in his facial puppet to be able to deliver that dialogue. So take a look at what happens here.
The thing I've loved absolutely the most is the wonderful opportunity that Matt Reeves has given Cody and I, as Alexander, to explore that relationship. And frankly, I could happily do that tons more, just tons more.
So that's great, but that's not Maurice, right? That's an orangutan pretending to be Karen. And it has this very uncanny, very animated quality to it, because those are very human movements and expressions coming through this ape face. And so a huge part of what the actors do is find a way to express emotion while still limiting themselves to ape-like movements. Here's that clip of Karen and Maurice again. And see how much more reserved Karen is in her facial performance here. Most of that performance is done just with the brows and with her eye movements. And it's that same scaling back of animation that we employ when translating the human performances to the apes. It's about finding the right balance between a shape the viewer can understand as being a particular emotion, while still making a shape that you can believe is coming from an ape's face. Our facial puppets are all built using blend shapes. There's over 1,200 blend shapes in Bad Ape here, and are driven by some 200 animation controls. Some of those shapes are built using dynamics in order to get things like the skin sliding over the brow or on the jaw here, but that's all baked back into blend shapes again, both to keep the puppet simple, but more importantly, to guarantee that the shapes the animator sees while they're working is exactly what we'll see in the final shot. And there's one exception to that, which I will cover later. Our facial puppets are GPU accelerated using CUDA, so our animators are able to work, scrub, and play blast in real time with the final hero render model. And again, that's incredibly important to make sure that what comes out in the render is exactly what the animators have seen while they're working, so we don't get any surprises in the facial performance. They can see how each expression affects all of the folds and wrinkles on the character's face and how that changes the expression. The video capture software here is pretty choppy, unfortunately, but that's actually running at about 50 frames a second on a mid-range GPU. We block out our facial rigs using a fairly standard set of fact shapes that's based both on generic facial reference, in this case some of our facial modeling team in the upper part frame there, as well as reference of the actor who's playing the character, which is Steve Zahn in the lower right there. And we do many, many iterations on the shapes as we develop the puppet. Again, we're trying to find that right balance between ape anatomy, the character, and the actor who's playing them. But while we're first building the puppet, we try to avoid extremes. We don't want to get those same uncanny shapes that we saw with the Maurice test I showed earlier. So we try and keep things in a more plausible ape-like range. There's some key areas, though, in which we do diverge from ape anatomy in order to be able to translate those performances. Those are the brows and the muzzle and the nasolabial fold. And these areas are particularly important on a human face for conveying emotion. For example, in this shot, you can see Steve is pulling his brow way down across his eyes to evoke that stern face like a parent telling off a child. And ape's brows are typically very heavy set and bony. And you can see here that they do have some mobility. In particular, the skin slides around a lot over them. But they don't have nearly the same range of movement as a human brow does. They can't frown in the same way that a human would understand it, for instance. And here's our first take at that shot we saw before. You can see that Bad Ape's brow doesn't come down nearly as far as Steve's does. And that's because, as I mentioned, when we're building the puppet for the first time, we just keep things in the more plausible ape-like range for the movements, while Steve's brow here is cutting right across his eyes. So all we do is we just create a new shape in the puppet matching Steve's expression. We can take the existing brow lower a shape, pop it out of the rig, sculpt it to match the reference frame the artist has chosen here of Steve, and then just pop it back into the facial puppet very quickly for the animators to use. And then here's the final shot showing that new shape in action.
Listen, human.
Bad ape.
So you can see how much more expressive Bad Ape is now. And this is a process that we work on all the way through production, right up until we're finally in the last shots in animation. Because as we start on new shots and we find new expressions, we're just continually updating the facial puppet to be able to match those performances. Now here's a very early test we did of Bad Ape, and I think this was actually the first thing we ever sent to Matt Reeves. And it's a very literal translation of what Steve's doing here. And it's kind of successful in that you can start to see the performance coming through, but it's not quite there yet. In particular, that smile that he's doing at the end there, it's very broad as Steve did it, but on Bad Ape's big muzzle, it looks kind of creepy, right? It looks a little bit like Bad Ape wants to eat Caesar or something. So in our next version, we've toned that smile down a little bit, something a bit more subtle. And you can see it's getting better, but it's still not quite there. And here's the final.
Long time.
So you'll see now that that smile is very, very subtle. It's almost imperceptible. But on Bad Ape's muzzle, it reads the same as that absent-minded, slightly cheesy smile that Steve Zahn's doing. So we've changed the extent of the movement in order to get the same read on Bad Ape as you do from Steve's performance. The exact motion is different, but the end result in terms of the emotion of the shot is the same. You'll also notice that we've enhanced that funnel shape he does there for the little vocalization at the end of the shot. And that's a very ape-like shape with a muzzle that human mouths can't really do. So apes' muzzles have a very different anatomy from humans. Apes' mouths are really designed for grabbing and stripping leaves off of branches, while humans are more designed for giving speech. So getting an ape's mouth to deliver speech can be quite tricky, especially when we're contrasting it with shots where they're doing things like eating, as you see in this example here. So we have two sets of controls for the animators in the facial puppet. One set for more ape-like movements, like action like this, and one set for more human-like movements, in particular delivering dialogue. Here's an example of a really complex, beautiful piece of animation that shows off that difference between the ape muzzle and the human muzzle. You'll notice here that we're actually switching between the two over the course of the shot because Bad Ape's delivering dialogue whilst also chewing a cracker.
Bad place. I find a long time ago after zoo, I look for food, I find human zoo.
So let's see how that's built up in animation. Here's where the facial animators start. You can see that we've got the body motion locked down from Steve's performance, but the face is completely static. So we start off with the basics. First, we do the eyes, and then we roll in the jaw movement, and then the brows. And these movements are really the foundation of the performance. Everything else is built on top of these, and the jaw in particular is essential to get locked down early since that drives the dialogue. That graph in the lower part of frame is just a screen grab from the animation graph editor. So each of those curves represents the animation on a particular shape in the puppet. And each of those keyframes, the little black dots there, represents a decision that the facial animators made on how best to match Steve's expression at any particular time in the shot. And you'll see how complex these get as we move through adding more and more layers on. So there's a fairly subtle change here just on the eyelids and the top of the muzzle. Even a fraction of a pixel change in the expression, particularly around the eyes, can completely change the way you perceive the character. And here we've added some movement to the cheeks to get the feeling of that cracker moving around in his mouth as he's eating. And then we add several more layers of control for that muzzle. So I mentioned before, it's got very, very complex motion compared to what human can do. So there's a whole bunch of things we need to add in here. In particular, this one, the folding effect as he's chewing, is a really key ape-like thing. The same thing with the corner pucker, we're adding onto the corners of his mouth here. And then the final little tweak here is essentially just grabbing a few CVs and moving the lip around, is just that little sideways twist he does with his lip. Again, that's adding those little ape-like features onto it. And it's those little details that the animators do that really elevate the character from being just a human wearing an ape mask into a real talking chimp. Now, I mentioned there was one exception to the blend shape rule we have for the facial puppets earlier, and that's in the creature solve that we do after the facial performance is complete. We actually do a tissue simulation on the ape's muzzle to just get that last little bit of really fleshy feeling to it and add a few more wrinkles. What's important, though, is that that's completely constrained to the lip shape that the animator's making, so it doesn't change anything about the dialogue or the way that the muzzle expresses. And here's a short clip from that scene that we were just looking at.
Eat! Eat! New friends. Special day.
you get this?
Bad place. I find a long time ago after zoo, I look for food. I find human zoo. Zoo for sick. Big walls. Sick human. Climb. Bad human. Kill. And then they all get sick. All dead now. A long time. Long time.
Bad humans. Soldiers. Soldiers.
So what I hope you take away from this is that the performances of the apes are 100% the actor's performances. But translating that performance from the actor to the digital ape takes painstaking work from our extremely talented team of facial animators. It requires analyzing the actor's performances to understand the intent and emotion behind every single frame of the shot. And it takes a detailed understanding of both ape anatomy and human anatomy in order to be able to translate from one to the other. And of course, a huge amount of skill and experience to be able to bring those performances to life. I'd like to finish by thanking all of these wonderful people back at Weta Digital who brought War for the Planet of the Apes to life. And in particular, Dan Lemon, the overall visual effects supervisor, and Dan Barrett, the animation supervisor. And of course, Matt Reeves, the director, whose energy and passion for the project really drove us to creating what I think is our best work to date. Thank you all very much for listening.